Kia ora, good morning. I'll just adjust this a little, being on the taller side. As you know, my name's Mathijs Lucassen. I felt quite, the previous two talks have been great. It's really wonderful for me in terms of coming to see a group of people who are so interested in the things that I'm also interested in. And when Alice was talking a bit about her experiences and her sort of passion, I guess, and reasons behind why she is involved in this field, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I felt inspired to just mention a little in terms of my own personal experience as to why I'm here today, really. Back in 1996, I was a bit younger and an undergrad university student down in Dunedin, and was coming out, and which was a challenging time for me. It was very useful to go to an icebreakers group, and I found that really beneficial. But unfortunately, in the course of the year that I was there, two of the young people that were in my group completed suicide. So I think that it had a massive impact, and has been my real motivation to work with young people with mental health challenges since, and more recently in a research role. So it's just a bit of my background in terms of why I'm so into youth mental health in particular. Oh, I should probably put on my presentation. So in terms of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about this morning, first I was going to start about definitions, and already we've had a little bit of a chat about definitions and how they are fraught. Then I'm going to talk a bit about suicide in young people generally, what we know about that, and then suicide in LGBTTI young people more specifically. And then I'm going to talk about two research projects that I've been involved with, and that they're related to the field of suicide and queer or LGBTTI young people. In terms of definitions, suicide, when I'm talking about suicide, suicidal ideation, a meaning is reference to thoughts of harming or killing oneself. Attempted suicide is a non-fatal, self-inflicted destructive act with an explicit or inferred intent to die, and suicide or completed suicide is a fatal, self-inflicted destructive act with explicit or inferred intent to die. So when we talk about suicidality, it's a combination of those three terms or concepts. Some of you are probably thinking, oh, this seems perfectly logical and wouldn't need to be defined, but I guess in terms of the stuff and the research around deliberate self-harm, there are some tensions in terms of where deliberate self-harm ends and suicidal ideations begin, and generally the idea is around intent or intentions, but we don't always know what they are, so that can make it a challenging field to research. Then I've got this next slide. It's definitions, LGBTTI young people. There's a picture there, and I asked the question, is this young person? And then a range of terms. Sort of somewhat a rhetorical question, because you can't tell from a picture. Again, I just wanted to highlight that because you'll get lay people who would say, people outside of the community who would say, oh, I can tell, show me a picture and I can tell you who they are and what they are. And I would challenge that because you can't do that. With the terms here that we're talking about today, lesbian, gay, takatapui, bisexual, trans, that's the abbreviation LGBTTI, and we can talk about those terms in terms of both sexual identity and gender identity, so intersex and trans. Sometimes takatapui also can be categorised as being gender or gender identity, and we can think about the others being sexual identity. It's just a fraught area. The language is really challenging. And in young people, it's also developmentally quite a challenge, because young people might not identify with any of the terms that I've got there on the left-hand side, because they might not like the political connotations, because they're still making sense of their own sexuality and gender. So it's important when we're thinking about young people to be sort of aware of that developmental context. Rightly or wrongly, in the Youth 2000 survey series, we talk about sexual attraction, and there are pros and cons to that. I guess the main advantage is that in a systematic lit review of population-based surveys that Professor Elizabeth Saywick did in the University of British Columbia, she found that if you survey young people and ask them about their sexual orientation, they have a preference for questions around sexual behaviour or same-sex sexual behaviour and sexual attraction over the sexual identity labels. So we've gone for the sexual attraction stuff in a lot of the work that I've been doing. Another one, I know I've heard the term today already, rainbow community. One that you might see a bit in the literature is sexual minority or gender minority. They tend to be terms I've actually never heard anyone talk about themselves as being a gender or a sexual minority. I don't generally do that myself, but it's quite useful in the academic world, I guess, as a term as well. So sometimes that's a phrase that you can hear heard. So in terms of suicide and young people generally, I've got here a figure, and unfortunately New Zealand is at the top of this figure. It's not something we want to be the top of the world in, or the top of the developed world, I should say, but this is trends in youth suicide rates per 100,000 people aged between 15 and 19 years. And you'll see this is trends from approximately 1990 all the way through to about 2010. There is a sort of a glimmer of hope there in terms of those rates dropping over time. But if we look at ourselves relative to the OECD average, which is that middle light blue trend line, you'll see that we're way above the OECD trend, and really we should be aspiring to be more like Italy, which is there with the red line at the bottom. Other English-speaking countries that are similar to ourselves in many ways, we've got the US and Australia slightly above that trend line, and the UK below it. So youth suicide is an issue in New Zealand. The risk factors for youth suicide, there are several of these. One is increasing age. The older the young person is, the more likely they are to complete suicide. A couple of reasons for that. One is, I guess, increasing cognitive ability, which means more sort of skill, which is sad, but more skill in terms of planning out suicide, and also less parental and other adult supervision. Male sex. Males have higher rates of completed suicide. That's predominantly because of methods used. Ethnicity. Minority ethnic groups are thought to be at an increased risk. The research is saying this is mostly or entirely linked to the disconnect for some people. So for some people that are disconnected from their cultural heritage, that places them at greater risk. I guess the parallel to that in terms of the stuff around sexuality is what we've already sort of people have mentioned in terms of being disconnected or perhaps having real challenges, being excluded, not having support. There's probably a parallel there for ethnicity, for people that are excluded from their culture of origin. That makes things harder for them. Severe and frequent suicidal ideation, that seems very logical. Previous attempt and the lethality of the suicide attempt, so that's the method used. Interpersonal conflict or loss is another risk factor. So if you think about family discord, relationship breakups, those are often factors involved in youth suicide. Mental ill health and things like depression, psychosis, substance misuse disorders, maltreatment, and exposure to suicide. So that's friends and family that have completed suicide. The good news is there's protective factors as well, so sound mental and emotional well-being, good social skills, skills in relation to managing your problems, positive engagement with schools, and family cohesion. Moira has already mentioned a bit about the Youth 07 study, and I've got the book, the little image there, and also a map of New Zealand, you know, in case any of you don't know what New Zealand looks like. But that's to sort of highlight that it's a survey that's nationally representative, and that's very useful because in terms of information about depression and suicide, there are only 2 other countries that have nationally representative data like this, Norway and the United States. So it's very unique. I mean, the counter-response from countries like Australia or Canada is that they're much bigger than us. So that's why it's easy for us to have nationally representative data. But we can say, well, it's because we're really efficient. So I guess we get the sort of international competitiveness about these sorts of surveys. And the Youth 2007 is the most recent with published results, but as Moira mentioned, we've got 2012 and we're working on results for that. And there's the item in terms of transgender young people. The orange hasn't turned out on my little pie chart there, but that sort of greyish area is supposed to be orange for opposite sex attracted. We have about 92% of secondary school students in New Zealand in 2007 who identified as being opposite sex attracted. About 6% can be classified as sexual minority, so that's attracted to the same sex, both sexes, or not sure of their sexual attractions, and about 2% are neither sex attracted. With increasing age, that group that are not sure of neither, so the students that are older in the survey are less likely to respond to say that they're not sure of neither. Oh, very good question. They're 12 to 19 years old, so secondary school students in New Zealand, representative of that group. I always say secondary school students because that means that they're probably a slightly healthier population than young people overall, because by doing a survey in a school, you're excluding the young people that aren't at school. So the kids that are sick on the day, or the kids, say for example, in our community, that are having such a hideous time at school, they just don't go to school, those that have been excluded, and so forth. So this is the sad thing about this is probably a slightly positive picture. It's probably in reality is that for an overall youth data is not that good. Also, the Christchurch Health and Development Study, the way in which they have 2.8% that they have classified as being LGB, and that's actually not that dissimilar to looking at the sexual attraction question. It's about 3% versus 4%. The way in which the Christchurch Health and Development Study conceptualised this is that they asked participants when they were younger what their sexual identity was. So are you heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, so forth. And then they classified them as LGB. And if you'd had a same-sex sexual partner from 16 onwards, then you're also classified as LGB. So it's a combination of sexual identity and sexual behaviour. And this study, just, I guess, acknowledgement to them that was really quite groundbreaking at the time, because it was a population-based study. They asked the question, and they looked at rates in terms of mental well-being. These young people now are not very young; they're 36 or thereabouts. So it's useful data in terms of youth mental health, more now historically. And things are probably changing. So most of the sexual minority youth were not suicidal and didn't have significant depressive symptoms, and that's what Moira has already said, and I like highlighting that because it's a positive message to be putting out there. And we're part of a vibrant, dynamic and great group, and these young people are going to be an asset to New Zealand. They already are. I've got here a couple of tables from a paper that we've published in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, which goes into a bit more detail from that Youth 07 report. And you'll see the current depressive symptoms, that was measured with the Reynolds Adolescent Depression Scale short form. So current depressive symptoms, opposite sex, we have the number there, the N is 687 young people or secondary school students, and about 10% who had current depressive symptoms. I made the call of splitting them up. There are challenges in that, but I guess for this paper it was interesting to do this and very useful. So the rates for the ones that are same-sex attracted, both sex attracted and not sure are considerably elevated, between 22% and 32%. And then you'll see in the next column I've got a little dotty box around the odds ratios with the confidence intervals. That's basically a way in which we can control for certain variables, and in this we controlled for ethnicity, age, sex, and level of socioeconomic deprivation. And once we control for those variables, we've still got more than double the odds of depressive symptoms in the sexual minority youth. The story is similar but actually worse in terms of attempted suicide. That's attempted suicide in the previous 12 months, and you'll see there 4% or thereabouts for the opposite sex attracted young people, and then much greater proportions for the same sex, both sex attracted and not sure, with 7 times the odds for the both sex attracted young people. What I might get you to do is if you've got questions, because sometimes what happens is once I show these slides with these numbers, people are like, I want to know a bit more about why this is. Just make a jot of those questions, and I'll try and whisk through the results, and then we can have all the questions at the end if that's okay. Deliberate self-harm, also a similar story. 20% of the opposite sex attracted young people, or 19.4%, had deliberately self-harmed, and the proportion was much greater in the sexual minority youth, or same both sex attracted and not sure group. In terms of how this compares to the Christchurch Health and Development Study, slightly different questions. In that major depression, any major depression between 14 to 21 years of age, again you've got greater proportions because it's depressive symptoms over a longer period of time. But if you look at the odds ratio, very similar story. And ever attempted suicide, again a very similar story in terms of elevated risk. And these bits of research I think are very useful in terms of making an argument for elevated risk in the young people that are LGB. For the intersex and transgender young people, we don't have that information yet, and we will hopefully have that for Youth 12 coming up soon. For the young people that weren't exclusively opposite sex attracted, we also found that they had increased difficulty getting help for emotional worries. This was quite important for the work I was doing for my PhD thesis in terms of arguing a case for why computerised therapy would be really useful. So why do we think LGBTTI youth are at increased risk? The research is suggesting it's because of increased rates of bullying and victimisation, family rejection, substance abuse, and increased rates of mood disorders. I completely agree, but from a sort of quantitative research paradigm or background, we are getting there in terms of having the evidence to really back that up. Because there isn't that much quantitative data to support that causal link. It's there, but it's an emerging field. So we could still have more robust data. I guess researchers always want more robust data, but it's definitely, I think, a field that is extending and expanding from now on. So I'm briefly going to talk about 2 research projects that I've been involved in. Rainbow Sparks, which is an intervention to help young people with depressive symptoms, and then Rainbow Youth's education package in schools and a formal evaluation that I've been involved with. So Sparks, this is an image from Sparks. You get to ride Te Hokioi, it's this giant eagle, and you go through 7 different levels. It's a computerised form of self-help based on principles of behavioural therapy, and a young person can do this at home. They can do it in the privacy of their own home at a time that suits them. And I was part of a team led by Associate Professor Sally Mary, who worked on the Sparks project. And in fact, in this room there are people that were involved in this project, and people will have known about this project and me going on about it since 2008. Mark Henriksen, who was an advisor on my PhD project, Thomas Hamilton, who was very instrumental in terms of recruitment and influencing what I did with the project, and Rawiri Wharamati, who introduced us all and set the scene for the morning. It was our kaumātua at the Weri Centre, so he was involved as well. So, and there are loads of other people that I just wanted to acknowledge being involved in this project. What I started out doing was looking at whether or not something like this, computerised form of therapy, could help LGBTTI young people. And so, because I thought computerised therapy has real potential. Growing up with Dutch sort of migrant farming background in rural New Zealand, I knew that you can't necessarily access culturally appropriate therapy outside of some of the major centres in New Zealand. So I thought that was a real strength of computerised therapy for our community. And the other is that it can be done in private when it suits a young person. So the studies basically were pitched around developing the resource and then evaluating it, and I had mixed methods in terms of the evaluation, both quantitative and qualitative results. And this is one of the characters with a sad face on. This was in the 2008 in development stage. Did a series of focus groups and asked young people, LGB young people, what they thought about prototypes of Sparks and what sort of content they thought should be added to make it relevant to them. And to summarise that project, the young people did a thematic analysis, and young people, there were 4 main themes that came out of that. Participants could tell that they were different, and the ways in which that the young people could tell they were different was by challenging gender role expectations. Another way was coming out. That was something that their heterosexual peers didn't experience. This is just a quote from what a young person said, Nell, who was not her real name, who was 17. She said, "I came out and I lost my teen years because I had to grow up. I had to get a job and find my own place to live and support myself." That's not the sort of thing that the average straight young person has to experience or go through, and it shouldn't be something we should have to go through, but it is an issue. Discrimination, homophobia and mistreatment. A quote from Raz, who's, again, not his real name, 16, said, "I lived there for a year," this is in reference to the South Island, "and that's when I went through my depression and I faced everything like beatings, discrimination, not even being able to get work because of who I was." Heterosexism is another example. My favourite from the focus groups was favourite in terms of how it stood out was a young woman talking about how some guy had asked her out, and then she said, "Well, I'm not interested." And then she's recounting this conversation, and then he said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Well, I'm not interested." And then he kept pursuing this and said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, I'm not into guys like this." You know, she was forced into a bit of a corner there, where she felt that way, I think. And then he said, "What, you're a lesbian?" like this, and she sort of responded, well, yes, I am, like this. And he said, "You can't be a lesbian." It's this classic example of heterosexism. You know, this very persistent young man who wasn't going to take any no for an answer, and clearly was very heterosexist. There was environments and their impact in relation to communities, neighbourhoods, families and schools, the ways in which participants coped, and I think this is very relevant for what we're talking about today in terms of friends and their value and the protective strength of that, and also the need for hopeful messages. So when we're talking about GLBTTI young people, it's very important to maintain and instill that aspect of hope. Depression and sexuality, young people talked about how difficult it was to get help, and also to get a culturally appropriate help. So that encouraged me to work with the computer games development company, Meteor Interactive, that developed Sparks, to create Sparks, the rainbow version. And there's just a couple of images from the program. In a nutshell, I conducted an open trial. Also, we had, the comparison was a larger randomised controlled trial with young people recruited from GP surgeries and secondary schools. We asked the students from the main study, or the larger randomised controlled trial, about their sexual attraction, so we could actually identify which young people were exclusively opposite sex attracted, so I could compare those two studies. But for the open trial, 21 young people had depressive symptoms at baseline, and identified as being same-sex attracted, both sex attracted, or not sure. About 91% completed the intervention, and 81% completed the 3-month follow-up. There's just a flow chart of that there. And in a nutshell, sexual minority youth, or those that were attracted to the same sex, both sexes, or not sure of their sexual attractions, were more likely to complete treatment, and that's in comparison to the larger randomised control trial, the exclusively opposite sex attracted young people from that. 85% thought that the treatment would appeal to other young people. Their depressive symptoms decreased significantly from pre to post intervention, with what we call a large pre to post effect size, which is clinically meaningful. And that positive change was maintained at follow-up. I've got a few quotes as well. This is from the qualitative evaluation. I asked, do you think that Rainbow Sparks helped you feel better? And Troy, who's not his real name, was 16, said, yes, it made me feel a lot better. I've been much happier because I was able to relate and use the information that I learned to better my situation. I like this one. Lara says, not really, but it did give me something to do at night, so it kind of helped. Sort of like keeping you busy, that's good. And then Bob, who was my youngest participant, said it worked for me. The second project is one that Tommy will know well, and Jamie Burford and Priscilla Pennicott from Rainbow Youth also know well. This was a project that we worked on last year, evaluating Rainbow Youth's education package in secondary schools. This is an education package that has 2 one-hour workshops, a 1-hour workshop on sexuality and a 1-hour workshop on gender diversity. And what was, I guess, an interesting challenge was to conduct these workshops and evaluate them with Year 9 and 10 students, because bullying is worse with the younger students. Mostly the workshops are done with the older students, Year 11 and 12 and 13. And we were very keen to see what impact it would have with the younger students. 237 students from 2 secondary schools participated. And Jamie led the part of the study that was qualitative, and again, just giving you the nutshell results. School climates were perceived to be hard and bullying or mocking for LGBTTI students, and 3/4 of the workshops would reduce bullying. That's the quantitative result there that I led, and very, very well received, with high satisfaction ratings as well. Any questions?
That Sparks program, is that available online currently?
Not available at the moment, but we're working on that. We had the funding for the broader Sparks project. We had funding for development and evaluation, and not for rollout. It's a bit more challenging than we thought in terms of getting the funding for the rollout. Understandably, we got the funding for development and evaluation because no one really wants to pay for it for a rollout if if all young people hate it, it doesn't work. So that's why it sort of has gone in those phases. But that is definitely on the to-do list for 2013.
Yeah, hi there, Mathijs. I'm just wondering, is there any, or have you done any research or study on youth suicide for youth who have same-sex parents versus heterosexual parents?
No. The stuff that I've done has been just about secondary school students more generally, and then a secondary analysis based on the students around sexual attraction. So don't know in terms of those with parents, but the little that I do know about that field, I believe that the thinking is having parents who are a same-sex couple are better than heterosexual couples in many ways. I don't know if it's in relation to suicide.
Thank you.
Do you know if there's any development on something like Spark for older age groups?
Well, there are other computerised therapy programs. Sparks is a youth-based program. There's Beating the Blues, which is a British program, and I believe that can be accessed through several GPs in and around New Zealand. So actually, in terms of computerised therapy, young people are usually the neglected population, and there's more in terms of adults. What I think would be the case, though, in New Zealand is that we won't have so many different resources that have been developed specifically for the New Zealand population. But of course, the one that stands out would be the Journal, which is the one with JK and that campaign and therapeutic program. That's computerised therapy as well, but not specific to sexuality. Yeah.
Hi. The study that was done on the Year 9 and 10 students, do we know what the decile rating of the schools were?
The decile rating? For which, sorry? The decile ratings where?
Of the schools.
Oh, and for Youth 07?
For that 7.
Yeah. Well, they are. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but it's a cross section of deciles across the whole of the country. So we'll have a spread of deciles. So not just low deciles, not just high deciles, but deliberately trying to capture the full range of schools in New Zealand. Yeah.
I understood that the statement was it was 2 schools.
Oh, sorry, the Rainbow Youth Education Package. Sorry, I thought you meant Youth 07. No, sorry, I didn't get that question right. No, that wasn't the full range of decile ratings. No, they were 2 lower decile rating schools.
They were the lower ones. So,
yeah.
So then the ethnicity would have been?
Predominantly not New Zealand European.
Right, thank you.
I was wondering, with the Youth 07 project, did you collect any information on the impact of social media or the digital environment?
There are questions around social media, digital environment, cyberbullying, those sorts of things. That is in the survey more generally. The tricky thing around the stuff around sexuality is that we're already starting with a really small group, so there's always those tensions between you've got a smaller group to start with, and then when you start looking at the sort of finer details, you don't really have the numbers to sustain further analysis. But yeah, there are questions about it in youth, all of those Youth 2000 surveys, on that topic.
In those youth groups where there was higher rates of suicide attempts, then the people the ones who hadn't, were they studied in terms of what their resilience and protective factors were?
Because it's a cross-sectional survey, so it doesn't do anything over time. We just have a snapshot in time. you can start looking at sort of what's called the sort of mediating or moderating factors. And I did start doing that, but technically it gets quite untidy. And I think that it's one of the challenges in this field is having small numbers to be able to do quite sort of sophisticated analyses. I think if you go down that path, the challenge is that you can sort of get ripped to shreds scientifically in terms of what you've done. So really the results might indicate something, but there's not enough substance to the numbers to basically make a compelling case. Scientifically compelling.
Yes, it's sad that,
Yeah,
that the people who are, we don't know.
yeah.
With all those studies with youth, was parental permission required for them to participate? And do you think that may in some ways skew the results favourably?
Is this consent for the Youth 07 survey, or?
Well, all those where you'd be looking at people under 16.
Oh, I have Mark will know this story well, and Tommy too. I had, well, probably not a paddy with the ethics committee when I was trying to get my ethics application in for the open trial for Rainbow Sparks, and having worked clinically, I said to them, well, I don't think you need to disclose to the parents that the young person or their child is same-sex attracted, both-sex attracted, questioning their sexuality. They can have all the other information, but I don't want to give them that information. I think the parents will want to know all that information, but I don't feel comfortable with the young person having to be out to their parents or outing themselves by participating in the study. And that's where we sort of had a disagreement in the ethics committee, I guess. Well, they're ethics committee, so they said, well, we're not going to let you do that. So for a period of time, only 16 to 19-year-olds could participate in the trial because they didn't need parental consent. But after a period of time, young people approached me and said that they could get parental consent. So the young people that I've got that are 13, 14 and 15 years old all had parental consent, and that did involve their parents being explicitly aware of the young person's sexuality, which is great and was, I think, a leap forward in terms of my own thinking and in terms of parents that would be supportive. But of course completely means that I think the younger group for that open trial is a group that were already quite comfortable with their sexuality and had quite supportive families.
Hi here. My question is about your intervention. Is you more focus on like a school or individual? But as for us, as my minority, I'm a Korean, and we're thinking of Maori as well. We have similar cultural, heritage, and as for me, I'm working with more like a family-based. If you educate very well with the school or any other organizations, but the success rates for helping the gay or LGBTTI people, that I'm thinking is more appropriate is family-based, or like Maori people come at tour, or like a Korean church leaders-based. If you educate them, and that's the most important help to our minority people.
Yeah.
So it's the more biggest impact is from family, from churches. So how do you think an intervention go to some different direction?
Yeah. Oh no, completely. I'm smiling just because as I was doing the Sparks project, my friend and colleague, Dr. Matt Shepherd, who's Māori and doing his doctorate in clinical psychology, conducted a sort of similar study with Māori young people. And one of the big key findings for him was this sort of form of therapy is very individualised, and he is looking at ways in which to support the program with whanau, making it so that the family gets involved, and it's more of a sort of collective focus in terms of intervention. I guess my challenge is that for lots of young people, GLBTTI young people, their families aren't really a source of strength, they're a source of stress and tension. And so it isn't, I agree with you in terms of education and advocating for improvements, but on an individual level, I think it varies a lot from young person to young person. Some young people have fantastic supportive families, a chunk have got families that are quite ambivalent, and then another chunk have got families that are, that can be quite toxic. So that is, that's a challenge in the field.
Aloha, my name is Felicia. I identify as Whawhawhine from Samoa, Whakawhiwhine from Niue, also have connections with Whakaleiti from Tonga, and Akawa'ine from the Cook Islands. You touched briefly on the fact that that disconnection from culture sort of was higher risk for these young individuals that were disconnected from culture in terms of suicide. My issue is around the terminology. Do you find this a barrier in understanding the cultural stuff when going out there and researching or trying to find information? I mean, is this a barrier? Because I feel that on the cold face, I'm fronted with a lot of individuals who are told, Pacific individuals who are told that it's okay to be identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, when in fact, when they're going home and they're told otherwise, what is a lesbian, what is gay, what is transgender, we don't understand that. You're whawhawhine. I mean, do you find those types of things in terms of cultural context, do you find it a barrier? Because I really don't hear it in the terminology or in any other findings, but I know we are a huge population in this country.
Yeah. Oh, no, completely. I think it's quite one of the things that I mean, it's so complex, and I guess the thing is when you're doing stuff, and I've done a lot of stuff that's been more quantitative, then you're sort of forced with numbers to work in categories, and that is quite limiting. And I think it's an area that you can get people in, say, youth mental health who will have a lot of the sort of cultural knowledge and cultural understandings, but it's rare to get the sort of combination of all sorts of those different aspects in one person. And so I acknowledge some of my own perhaps research limitations, but I would also like to say that I keep trying my best to do better. So one of the things is around consultation, but the other is just thinking how are each of these things stepping stones. And so I think we won't ever in one study address lots of different aspects or components, but through a combination and with building blocks, I think we can move forward. Probably not necessarily a straightforward answer, but also not a straightforward question. A complex field, really, how the intersection between culture, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, how that's conceptualised. It can be so different, and where one begins and one ends, because people will have different understandings around that as well.
I just really noticed the difference in New Zealand rates of suicide, even just in general, and the other countries. Has it sort of been identified what it is exactly that has us standing so far above other countries in the OECD, and is some of that a factor of our sort of societal Kiwi cultures? Because one of the things I noticed as a young gay person was I had supportive friends. My parents weren't too bad, but there was still very much a feeling of, if I want to look at a book in the library and type the word lesbian in the computer, who's watching? And that was more a fear of the messages that were coming from society.
Yeah, it's hard. This is when we get the data, you can come up with hypotheses, really, and it could be a range of different things. It could be that we have higher rates with younger people, but proportionately lower rates further along the lifespan. It could be, Yeah, I don't. The short answer is I actually don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows categorically. We just have different hypotheses as to why that would be, and it's curious because it's other English language countries, other countries that speak predominantly English have much lower rates. So it's sort of, why are we that different? So it's hard to know.